On the scorched earth, Rancher gave a dying enemy a sip of water. That night, 300 warriors came to his door, bowing their heads in silent debt. But with the dawn rose those who hungered for blood and gold. Into the Jornada del Muerto, he walked to meet death, knowing there was no way back. And when fire consumed the sands, one man stood between the world and war. It started as a faint trail along the dirt path near his well, dark stains against the pale dust, leading toward the shadow of the barn. Tobias froze, instincts honed from years of hard living kicking in. Blood meant trouble out here, trouble that had teeth, claws, or worse, walked on two legs. He followed the trail slowly, rifle in hand, every sense alert. When he rounded the corner of the barn, the sight waiting for him made his stomach tighten like a cinched cinch strap. A man, no, a warrior, slumped against the stone base of the well. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. One hand pressed hard against his side, where blood soaked through a torn buckskin shirt. The other reached feebly toward the bucket, dangling just out of reach above his head. His face, sharp as carved obsidian, lifted toward Tobias, with eyes dark as midnight and clouded with pain. Apache. Every story Tobias had ever heard about Apaches came roaring back like a flood. Raids on wagon trains, ambushed stagecoaches, burned homesteads. Men said they were ghosts in the rocks, warriors who killed without mercy. And here one was, bleeding out by Tobias's well. His finger hovered over the trigger of his Winchester. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to finish what that bullet started. No one would question it. Hell, most would thank him. Then the warrior spoke. Just one word, cracked and broken like dry earth. Water. Tobias felt something twist inside him. He remembered the drought of '44. Remembered thinking he'd never taste cool water again. That thirst, that desperation, it didn't care about color, language, or war. It was just human. Slowly, Tobias lowered his rifle. He brought the bucket down, filled an old tin cup, and held it to the warrior's lips. The man drank like a drowning soul, his whole body trembling as the water slid down his throat. Tobias gave him another cup, and another, until the edge of death seemed to loosen its grip. But as the warrior sagged back against the stone, Tobias saw the wound for what it was. A gunshot, fresh and ugly. Someone had done this to him, and whoever it was might still be tracking that blood trail straight to Tobias's door. And then came the sound that turned Tobias's blood cold. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, then growing louder, rolling across the plains like distant thunder. Tobias glanced at the wounded Apache, then toward the horizon blazing with the last light of day. Whoever shot this man wasn't finished yet, and Tobias Garrison had a choice to make. The hoofbeats drew nearer, rhythmic as a war drum. Tobias's breath came slow, deliberate, the way it did before a bronc exploded out of the chute. He looked down at the wounded Apache, at the dark eyes staring up at him, not pleading, not begging, just waiting, like a man who'd faced death before and knew its shape. "Damn it," Tobias muttered under his breath. He slung the Winchester over his shoulder and crouched beside the warrior. "Can you stand?" The question was useless. One look at that wound said no. The Apache shook his head anyway, his jaw tightening in silent defiance. They'd both be dead if Tobias left him here. And if the riders coming weren't friendly, well, the law didn't bother knocking before they strung up a man for harboring an Indian. He'd seen what happened to ranchers who tried. But Tobias wasn't built for watching men die slow when a hand could save them. With a grunt, he hooked his arms under the warrior's shoulders and hauled him upright. The Apache hissed between his teeth, blood soaking Tobias's shirt in a spreading warmth. Every step toward the cabin felt like dragging a sack of wet grain uphill in a storm. But Tobias didn't stop until they were through the door. He kicked it shut, heart-hammering, and laid the man on his bed, the only bed. The smell of iron filled the small room, sharp and heavy. The Apache's breathing was shallow, uneven, and Tobias knew he had minutes, maybe less, before the man slipped past the point of no return. He grabbed his last jar of whiskey and a needle from a dusty kit he hadn't touched since his wife died. His hands were steady, but his mind wasn't. Who in hell was this man? And why did Tobias feel like the entire weight of the territory had just landed on his shoulders? A shadow passed across the window. Tobias froze, his fingers clenched around the needle. The hoofbeats had stopped. Voices murmured outside. Low. Purposeful. One of them barked a command. The words carried sharp and clear on the evening wind. Spread out. Find him. Tobias's stomach turned to stone. Whoever was out there, they weren't lawmen looking to help. These were hunters. And the man bleeding on Tobias's bed? He wasn't just a stray Apache warrior. He was something bigger. Something worth killing for. The warrior stirred, his voice a rasp like wind over dry bones. Name Dakota, he whispered. His eyes burned into Tobias's with something fierce, something that felt like a warning and a promise. Then he said one more word, one that chilled Tobias's blood more than any rifle barrel could. Chief. The pounding on the door rattled the hinges, a sharp reminder that Tobias Garrison was out of time. He glanced at the Apache Dakota, who lay pale as bone on the bed, his blood soaking through Tobias's only quilt. Those dark eyes were open, calm in a way that made Tobias wonder if death didn't scare him at all. Garrison! The voice outside was a rasp of authority, thick with contempt. We tracked that redskin to your well. Open this door now, or we'll burn you out like a nest of rattlers. Tobias moved silently across the cabin, sliding the Winchester from its rack. His mind spun like a wagon wheel in mud. 5 voices, maybe 6. Men who'd ridden hard, hunting a wounded Apache. They'd seen the blood trail. They knew. And men like that didn't come for talk. He eased the curtain with the barrel, peering through the slit. Moonlight glinted on rifle barrels, on spurs that jangled softly as boots shifted in the dirt. 6 riders, horses slick with sweat. Hard men. The kind who carried rope on their saddles for jobs the law never wrote down. Tobias's jaw tightened. 1 against 6 wasn't a fight. It was a sentence. But surrender wasn't an option, not with Dakota lying behind him. Whatever storm had blown this man onto his land, it was big enough to send wolves sniffing at his door. And wolves didn't leave sheep alive. Another pounding. Then the voice again, colder this time. You got 10 seconds to open up. After that, we light the torch. From the bed came a low sound. Not a groan, not pain. A word. Tobias turned, saw Dakota staring straight at him, lips forming syllables that cracked like dry wood. No! Give! Tobias understood. The chief wasn't asking for mercy. He was commanding him not to surrender. And God help him, Tobias found himself nodding. He crossed to the fireplace, yanked a length of iron from the coals. The poker glowed red at the tip. He slammed it against the wall, sending sparks flying. The sudden clang made the horses outside snort nervously. 3 seconds, Garrison! The leader barked. Then we come in shooting! Tobias dropped the iron and lifted the rifle, feeling its weight settle into his shoulder like an old friend. His voice came out calm, steady, the way it hadn't in years. You best bring more men. The silence that followed was a living thing. Then boots shuffled, and the leader spoke one last time, low and certain. Your choice. Flames licked the edge of a torch outside. Its glow danced across the window pane like the promise of hell itself. The torch kissed dry timber, and the smell of smoke curled into Tobias's nostrils. Every instinct screamed to act now or watch his world turn to cinders. He slid to the window, jammed the Winchester through the gap in the shutters, and squeezed the trigger. The crack split the night wide open. A man outside howled, his rifle clattering against the stones. Horses reared, men cursed, boots thudded as they scattered for cover. Tobias racked another round, his heart pounding like a blacksmith's hammer. Damn you, Garrison! The leader's voice, ragged with fury. "You just signed your death paper!" Bullets punched through the walls, splinters spraying like angry bees. Tobias dropped low, crawling across the floor. The Apache chief stirred on the bed, his eyes burning with that same eerie calm. He wasn't afraid, not of dying, not of killing. And Tobias understood why the men outside wanted him dead so bad. Dakota wasn't some nameless warrior. He was a leader, a keystone in a world balanced on a knife's edge. Tobias saw it now. The weight behind those dark eyes, the authority even in weakness. Whoever hunted him wasn't just after vengeance. They wanted to set fire to more than Tobias's cabin. They wanted to burn the whole territory down. Another shout outside. "Light her up! Burn the bastard out!" Through the shutter crack, Tobias saw two men dart toward the porch, torches blazing. He didn't think. He moved, rolled across the floor, popped up by the door, and fired twice. One torch dropped. One man spun, clutching his shoulder. The other dove for the woodpile, fire licking his hand as he crawled. But for every shot Tobias fired, 3 came back, riddling the door with lead. Glass shattered. A bullet tore through the whiskey jug on the shelf, spilling liquid gold across the floorboards. Flames hissed where sparks kissed the liquor. Smoke curled thick now, clawing at Tobias's lungs. He coughed, eyes stinging, mind racing for a way out. Then he heard it, soft but sharp, like a knife drawn slow from its sheath. "Apache," Dakota's voice. Tobias turned. The chief had pulled a small object from his belt, a pouch, worn and stained with blood. He held it out, his hand trembling but steady in purpose. Inside the pouch gleamed something Tobias didn't expect. A string of eagle feathers bound with silver, and a carved medallion etched with symbols older than the land itself. "Chief's sign," Dakota rasped. "If I die, war comes." The words hit Tobias like a hammer. War. Not just a skirmish, not a raid. War. If Dakota fell tonight, the sun would rise on a territory drowned in blood. Outside, the leader barked fresh orders. Horses stamped. Steel clinked. They were circling, tightening the noose. Tobias gripped the Winchester and looked at the chief, then at the door, trembling under another hail of bullets. The choice was clear, and it wasn't just about saving one man anymore. The smoke thickened, coiling around Tobias like a living thing. Each cough burned his throat raw, but he didn't dare stop moving. He crawled to the side window, shoved the barrel through a gap, and fired blind into the night. A scream answered him, proof that at least one of those bastards had gotten more than splinters. "Hold your ground," the leader roared. "We'll burn 'em out with the redskin inside." Boots pounded against the earth. Shadows danced in torchlight, their glow flickering across the porch. Tobias's rifle was down to 3 rounds. His Colt hung heavy at his hip, but 6 bullets weren't near enough for what waited outside. And then he heard it again, the sound that didn't belong. Hoofbeats. Not 6, not 10. A swarm of them, rolling like a storm over the plains. Deep, rhythmic, growing louder by the second. The men outside heard it too. Silence fell like a dropped hammer, broken only by the frantic snort of horses. Then came a voice, sharp with fear. "Riders, from the north!" Tobias peered through the smoke-stained glass. At first, he saw nothing, just the moon crawling over black hills. Then they appeared, silhouettes cresting the rise. Lines of them, dozens. No, hundreds. The firelight caught the first glint of polished lances. Then feathers streaming from braids. Then faces painted in the colors of war. Apache. Tobias's breath locked in his chest. They came like a tide of shadows and steel, the earth trembling beneath the weight of 300 pounding hooves. The night filled with the low thunder of their approach and the rising, bone-deep wail of war cries that clawed at the stars themselves. The men outside broke. Panic splintered their formation as torches dropped and rifles swung toward the advancing wave. One shouted something about reinforcements, but his words drowned under that roar, the sound of a people who had come for blood. On the bed behind him, Dakota's lips curved, not in a smile, but in something harder, sharper. A look Tobias had seen once before, on a general the moment he knew the tide had turned. Through cracked lips, the chief spoke one word, a word that rolled like distant thunder. "Brothers!" Tobias turned back to the window just as the first Apache riders swept into the yard, their lances gleaming like lightning under the cold moonlight. The earth shook like God himself was pounding his fist against the plains. The first wave of Apache riders crashed into the yard, circling the cabin with the grace of hawks and the fury of a thunderstorm. Lances lowered, rifles cocked, their war cries splitting the night wide open. The 6 bounty hunters outside scattered like jackrabbits, scrambling for their saddles. One didn't make it. A blur of horse and steel cut him down before his boots left the dirt. Another fired wildly, his shot cracking the dark before an arrow pinned his arm to the porch post. His scream was swallowed by the roar of hooves. Tobias pressed his back to the cabin wall, breath shallow, rifle slick in his hands. The smoke from his own burning porch clawed at his lungs, and the heat licked his boots like a hungry dog. If the Apaches didn't kill him, the fire sure would. Then the circle broke. From the storm of riders came a single figure, gliding forward on a white horse that shone ghost-pale in the moonlight. The warrior sat tall, draped in a mantle of eagle feathers that shimmered like frost. His face was a map of scars and wisdom, his eyes black as the depths of an old well, and twice as dangerous. The war cries died as if choked by the night itself. Silence fell, heavy and sharp, broken only by the crackle of flames and the rasp of Tobias's own breathing. Every rider turned their horse toward that white figure. And in that moment, Tobias knew this wasn't just a chief. This was the chief. The man spoke. One word in Apache, guttural and commanding. Instantly, 3 warriors dismounted and stormed the porch, kicking the burning timbers aside with boots and wet hides. Tobias raised his Winchester, ready to make his last stand, until Dakota's voice cut through the smoke like a blade. "No shoot." Tobias froze. The wounded Apache had hauled himself upright, one hand gripping the bedpost, his face pale but eyes blazing. He staggered toward the door, his body a silhouette of pain and pride. When the door swung open and the smoke spilled out, the world outside seemed to bow in his direction. A sound rose from the riders, low, rhythmic, almost like a chant. The white horseman swung down and crossed the yard, boots crunching in the dirt. He stopped in front of Dakota and spoke in their tongue, the words rolling like distant thunder. Dakota answered, voice weak but steady. Then the great chief turned his gaze on Tobias. For a long moment, the world held its breath. His eyes were bottomless, unreadable, and in them Tobias felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments. Finally, the chief spoke in English. His voice was deep as canyon walls. "You gave him life," he said slowly, "and for that, we kneel." The riders moved as one. 300 Apache warriors slid from their saddles and dropped to one knee, their lances lowered, their heads bowed, not to Dakota, but toward Tobias's door. Tobias stood frozen, the Winchester limp in his hands. He'd expected death tonight. Instead, the earth itself seemed to bow at his feet. But the chief wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Tobias whole. "Now," he said, eyes burning like coals, "you will give him more, because a storm is coming, and only you can stop it." The fire on the porch hissed under wet hides, smoke curling into the starry night. 300 Apache warriors knelt like shadows made flesh, their war paint glinting in the pale moonlight. Tobias stood in the doorway, boots rooted to the floor, his rifle suddenly feeling like a child's toy in a giant's hand. The great chief, broad as an oak, his black braids streaked with silver, stared at him with eyes that could have split stone. When he spoke again, his words were slow and heavy, like stones dropped in a deep well. "You fed him when others would kill. You gave what was yours when you had little." He paused, letting the silence press down like a weight. "Now you will do more." Tobias swallowed hard. "I gave him water. "A meal. That's all I've got to give, Chief." The man's expression didn't change. He stepped closer, boots whispering against the dirt, until Tobias could smell the smoke and horse sweat on his mantle. "You gave him life," the chief said, "but life is not enough. Dakota is my blood, my son, and those who tried to kill him still hunt. They ride with white men's guns, with white men's gold, to start a fire that will burn this land for 100 winters." The words struck Tobias like a hammer. Dakota, the man bleeding on his bed, wasn't just any warrior. He was the son of the most feared and respected leader west of the Rio Grande, the one named mothers whispered to hush crying children, the man whose war parties could make the cavalry vanish like dust in wind. The chief leaned in, his voice dropping low, a promise and a threat tangled in one. "Help us carry him home and live. Refuse." He let the silence finish the sentence, his gaze sliding toward the ring of warriors surrounding the yard. Tobias's grip on the Winchester tightened until his knuckles went white. He wanted to spit in the dirt, tell the old man to ride back into the night and take his problems with him. But when he turned his head, his eyes landed on Dakota. The young chief's face was pale as moonlight, his body shivering under fever's grip, but his eyes burned like coals in a dying fire. Pride, pain, and something else. A plea he'd never voice aloud. Tobias cursed under his breath. He wasn't a hero. Hell, most days he barely qualified as decent. But walking away from a man who'd put his trust in him, even a man from a people the world swore was his enemy, that wasn't in him. He looked back at the great chief. "Where?" he asked. His voice came out like gravel under boots. "Where do I take him?" The old man's lips curved. Not in a smile, but in something colder. "Through the Jornada del Muerto. 3 days' ride. No food, no water." His eyes flickered toward the horizon, where the desert stretched like a hungry beast. "And the men who hunt my son, they know this path. They will follow, they will kill." Tobias let out a sharp laugh, bitter as old whiskey. "You're asking me to ride through hell with a dying man on my back, chased by killers, and trust that you'll keep your promise when it's done?" The chief stepped closer still, until his shadow swallowed Tobias whole. His next words were a knife edge. "No, white man, I am not asking." Behind him, 300 warriors rose as one, their voices rolling into a low chant that made the earth itself tremble. The chanting faded into the night as the great chief raised his hand. Warriors moved like shadows, swift and silent. 2 slipped inside Tobias's cabin and lifted Dakota as gently as if he were a newborn, carrying him to a waiting horse. Tobias stepped forward instinctively, his gut tightening. "Hold on," he snapped, his voice harsher than he meant. "He won't make a mile in that condition." The elder turned, his obsidian eyes cutting through the darkness. "He will ride," he said simply, "or the land will burn." Tobias stared back, fists curling. Then he saw the fever sweat on Dakota's brow, the tremor in his hands. Damn it all! If he didn't help, the man would die before the next sunrise, and 300 warriors would paint the prairie red for his death. "Fine," Tobias growled, "but he rides in my wagon. If I'm doing this, I do it my way." The chief gave a single curt nod, a flick of his wrist, and warriors fanned out to fetch Tobias's team. Minutes later, his old buckboard creaked under the weight of hastily thrown blankets and a frame that had carried more hay than men. Dakota was laid in the back, his breathing shallow, eyes half-lidded but burning when they met Tobias's. "This is madness," Tobias muttered, climbing onto the seat. 3 days through the Jornada del Muerto with half the territory gunning for us. "You fear death?" The chief's voice was soft, almost amused. Tobias snapped the reins. The horses lunged forward, hooves thudding against hard-packed dirt. "I don't fear it," he said, his eyes fixed on the black horizon. "But I sure as hell ain't planning to meet it tonight." Behind them, the great host of warriors melted into the shadows like smoke in the wind, leaving Tobias alone with the desert and the weight of an Apache prince bleeding out in his wagon. The only sound was the creak of wheels and the rasp of Dakota's breath, For 2 miles the land lay silent under the cold stare of the moon. Then Tobias heard it, far off, faint, but rising, the echo of hoofbeats. Not Apaches this time. No chant, no cry. Just the flat, merciless rhythm of men riding hard. Dakota stirred, his voice raw as broken stone. "They come," he whispered. "Who?" Tobias asked, even as his gut told him the answer. The young chief's eyes opened, and in them Tobias saw fire and iron. "The Black Spurs," he said, "killers for gold, men who would burn the world for $1. Tobias spat into the dust. He'd heard of the Black Spurs, guns for hire, men who didn't just kill for money but for sport. If they were on this trail, then God help anyone who crossed it. He flicked the reins hard. The wagon jolted forward, wheels screaming against rock. The jornada stretched ahead like the throat of a waiting beast, 3 days of thirst, heat, and death. And somewhere behind them, hell was saddling up. The jornada stretched before Tobias, like the throat of some vast, starving beast, white bones of dead cattle glinting under a sky that burned like hammered iron. The wagon rattled over cracked earth, every groan of its wheels sounding like a prayer gone unanswered. Behind him, Dakota lay pale as the moon, his breath shallow fever sweat soaking the blanket Tobias had thrown across him. Then, crack. The sound split the morning calm like lightning. Tobias felt the wagon lurch hard right as a wheel exploded into splinters. The horses screamed, rearing against their harness. The wagon tipped, spilled, crashed down in a shower of dust and broken wood. Tobias rolled hard, grit grinding his teeth, and came up with his Winchester already snapping to his shoulder. Another shot kicked dust 2 feet from his boot. He dove behind a chunk of black basalt, jutting from the desert floor. His eyes swept the horizon, empty as judgment, until a figure walked out of the heat haze. Tall, broad-shouldered, black duster coats swirling in the wind, spurs glinting like tiny fires. A face cut from stone, scarred across the jaw. And those eyes, cold and pale as winter sky. Malachi Crow. Tobias knew the name before Malachi even opened his mouth. The Black Spurs leader, a man whose legend was written in blood. Malachi stopped 20 paces out, calm as a preacher at Sunday service, his Henry rifle resting easy against one shoulder. Behind him, 6 more riders fanned out like wolves circling a crippled steer. "Well now," Malachi drawled, voice smooth as snake oil. "You've had yourself a busy night, Garrison. Shot up a fine bunch of bounty men, burned down a porch, and here I find you, dragging a half-dead Apache through God's own killing ground." Tobias spat into the dust. "You come to preach or pull the trigger?" Malachi smiled then, slow, cruel, like a knife sliding from its sheath. "Neither, friend. I come to make you rich." He reached into his coat, pulled a wad of greenbacks thick enough to choke a horse, and let it flutter in the hot wind. $10,000, Garrison. All you gotta do is step aside and let me finish what you started." Malachi tilted his head toward the wagon wreck, where Dakota lay motionless, his chest barely lifting. "Or," Malachi added softly, "you can die in the sand for a man who'd slit your throat soon as shake your hand." The desert held its breath. Tobias stared at the money, then at Malachi's pale eyes. $10,000. A new life. Maybe even peace. His fingers tightened on the Winchester. "I reckon," Tobias said, his voice low as a rattler's hiss, "you ain't half as scary as you think you are." Malachi's grin widened, sharp as broken glass. "Then let's dance." The money fluttered from Malachi's fingers and vanished into the wind like a lie, and with it went the last chance of peace. The first shot cracked before Tobias even moved. Dust leapt at his boots as he threw himself flat behind the basalt slab, the Winchester snug in his shoulder. He snapped off a shot without aiming. One rider screamed and tumbled into the dirt. The desert came alive in fire. Bullets screamed, ricocheting off stone. Horses snorted, hooves drumming like war drums. Tobias ducked low, teeth gritted, counting rounds. 6 left. He waited for the pause. That heartbeat between shots, then rolled out and fired again. Another rider pitched sideways, his blood painting the pale sand. Malachi didn't flinch. The bastard just strolled through the smoke and heat like a Sunday walker, rifle spitting fire. Tobias felt the air split by his ear as a slug kissed the rock behind him. Close. Too close. Last chance, Garrison. Malachi's voice rang clear through the chaos. Step aside! You don't owe that savage a damn thing! Tobias jammed another round into the chamber, eyes blazing. He ain't the savage, he growled, and squeezed the trigger. The shot took Malachi's hat clean off. Dust puffed from his shoulder as he staggered but didn't fall. The man just laughed, a low, cold sound that crawled down Tobias's spine like an ice snake. Now you've gone and made it personal. The remaining spurs tightened their circle, bullets sparking like lightning on stone. Tobias's Winchester clicked empty. He yanked his Colt free, spun, and dropped another man with a round to the chest. Then a scream tore through the smoke. Not a spur. Tobias spun. Dakota had rolled from the shattered wagon, dragging himself across the sand, a knife clutched in one blood-slick hand. His eyes burned fever-bright, his body shaking like a storm-lashed tree. Dakota! Tobias bellowed. But then a shadow loomed behind the young chief. Malachi, moving silent as death, long knife gleaming in his fist. Tobias raised the Colt, heart hammering. One bullet left. One shot to end it. Malachi's blade flashed down. The gunshot cracked like a whip across the Jornada. For a breathless instant, the world froze. Malachi Crow stood, knife dangling, eyes wide with surprise. Then his knees buckled, and he toppled into the dust like a felled tree, blood soaking his black duster. Tobias let out a long breath that scorched his throat. One bullet left in the Colt, and it had found the right devil. But the fight wasn't over. Malachi's men howled like wolves and charged through the smoke, rifles blazing. Tobias dove behind the wrecked wagon, firing his last round point-blank into the chest of a spur who'd gotten too close. The man collapsed, dragging Tobias down with him. When Tobias staggered free, the desert was littered with bodies, and empty of foes. The survivors had fled into the shimmering heat, leaving behind only dust and death. Tobias stumbled toward Dakota. The young chief lay sprawled in the sand, blood dripping from his lips, his knife buried to the hilt in Malachi's ribs. His fever-glazed eyes flicked toward Tobias, burning with something fierce even as life bled from him. "Brother," the word rasped out like dry wind. Tobias knelt, sliding an arm beneath Dakota's shoulders. The man felt lighter than a sack of bones, heat radiating off him like a forge. Tobias pressed a canteen to his lips, but most of the water spilled down his chin. "Stay with me," Tobias muttered, his throat tight. "Just a little longer." Dakota shook his head weakly. "Not my time," he whispered. Then his eyes rolled shut, his chest heaving shallow and ragged. Tobias stared down at him, feeling something cold coil around his heart. He couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after all this blood, all these miles. Then he heard it. A low, rhythmic thrum rolling across the dead land. At first, Tobias thought it was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, until it grew louder, deeper. War drums, beating slow as doom on the horizon. He turned, squinting into the heat haze. There, shadows moving like smoke. Dozens. No, scores of them. Riders. Lances glinting like teeth. But something was wrong. These weren't the great chief's men. The paint was different. The cries that carried on the wind were harsh, jagged, a language twisted by rage. Renegades. And they weren't alone. Through the shimmer, Tobias saw the flash of gun barrels, the glint of Spurs's badges. The survivors had fetched more wolves to the hunt. 50, maybe more. Tobias's hand closed on Malachi's rifle lying in the sand. He racked around, teeth bared. "Well," he muttered, lifting Dakota into his arms and staggering toward a line of jagged rocks. "Looks like hell ain't done with us yet." The sun bled into the horizon like an open wound as Tobias reached the rock bluff, a spine of black stone jutting from the endless sand. He hauled Dakota into a shallow alcove, the Apache chief's skin hot as a forge, breath rattling like dry leaves. Fever was chewing him alive. Tobias dropped his rifle, hands shaking as he tore Malachi's cartridge belt free. 20 rounds, maybe 30, against 50 men and a pack of renegade warriors hungry for blood. Odds that would make the devil laugh. He jammed bullets into the Henry, teeth clenched, eyes flicking to the shimmering line on the horizon where the enemy crawled closer. Drums pounded a slow, merciless rhythm, echoing off the stone like the heartbeat of some vast predator. "Stay with me," Tobias muttered, glancing at Dakota. The young chief stirred, lips cracking into a faint smile. "You afraid, Garrison?" he rasped. Tobias spat in the sand. "Only of running out of bullets." Then they came, shadows sliding out of the dusk, their shapes warped by the heat. Painted faces streaked red and black, teeth flashing under snarls. Behind them rode the spurs, rifles glinting like the eyes of snakes. Malachi's death had bought Tobias nothing but rage. The first shot rang like a bell across the jornada. Tobias answered with fire. The Henry kicked against his shoulder, coughing smoke and lead. One man folded, another reeled from his saddle. Horses screamed, dust boiling under hooves. They charged like a wave of knives, and Tobias met them head-on, his rifle singing death until the barrel smoked. He dropped the Henry, snatched the Colt from his belt, and cursed when the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. "Damn you!" he growled, snatching up Malachi's Bowie knife just as the first renegade vaulted the rocks. Steel flashed in the dying light, a scream ripping the air as Tobias drove the blade home. Then the world dissolved into chaos. Gunfire cracking, arrows hissing, war cries tearing at the stars. Blood sprayed hot across the stone, men grappling like wolves in the dust. Through it all, Tobias fought like a man with nothing left to lose, his fists and blades slick, his breath ragged. Every second bought was a miracle, every heartbeat a defiance. But when the smoke cleared, the ground was a butcher's yard. The last bullet was gone, the last blade dripped red, and still, shadows moved beyond the flames. Dozens more, their war paint glowing under the ghost light of the moon. Tobias staggered back to the alcove, blood running from a cut on his temple, breath tearing his chest. Dakota lay motionless, his fever-bright eyes fixed on Tobias with something like sorrow and pride. "Go," Dakota whispered. "Leave me." Tobias laughed, a raw, broken sound. "Ain't in my nature." The drums quickened, rolling like thunder across the desert. Death was coming fast and hard, and Tobias Garrison was ready to greet it. The night split open with drums and hoofbeats, as the renegades swarmed the bluff like wolves tasting blood. Tobias pressed his back against the black stone, Malachi's empty Henry dangling from his grip, his knife sticky with death. The cartridge belt was gone, his Colt was dry, but he had one trick left. From the shattered wagon, Tobias had dragged 2 kerosene tins, his last ace in a deck dealt by the devil. Now he ripped them open with the Bowie knife, sloshing the slick firewater across the sand in a wide crescent before the rocks. The stench of oil rose sharp as brimstone. Dakota stirred behind him, voice a broken rasp. "You burn them?" Tobias crouched, flint in hand, jaw tight as a cinched rope. "No," he growled, "I burn everything." The renegades rode closer, their silhouettes jagged against the bone-white moon. Spur's rifles flashed like fireflies in the gloom. Tobias struck the flint. Once, twice, sparks hissing into nothing. A bullet shrieked past his ear, spraying stone chips. Then, woof! Flame leapt like a starving beast, racing across the oil, spitting and snarling. In a breath, the desert roared alive, a wall of fire towering against the night. Horses screamed, men cursed as heat rolled over them in waves. Smoke clawed the sky like black talons. But the fire didn't stop them. Shadows burst through the flames, screaming, burning, charging straight into hell with steel in their fists. Tobias roared back, a sound torn from somewhere deep, somewhere raw. He swung the bowie like an axe, carving death in the firelight. A rifle stock smashed his ribs. He drove the blade home in answer. Hot blood sprayed his face. The world shrank to heat and fury, flame licking his boots, steel ringing against bone, the stink of sweat and charred flesh choking the air. Tobias fought on instinct, his arms heavy, lungs afire, eyes stinging from smoke and rage. Then a shape loomed through the inferno, tall, broad, pale eyes glowing like coals. Malachi Crow. The bastard wasn't dead. The desert had spit him back out, black duster smoking, knife gleaming in his hand like the fang of some hell-born serpent. Malachi grinned through cracked lips, teeth white in the firelight. "Told you, Garrison," he rasped, stepping over the dead. "One of us ain't walking out of this." Tobias squared his shoulders, bowie slick in his grip, heart pounding like the drums beyond the fire. "Then come and find out which one." They lunged together as the flames howled higher, steel flashing in the furnace glare. Fire painted the desert in shades of hell. Sparks hissed like angry snakes as Tobias and Malachi crashed together in a storm of steel. The bowie in Tobias's fist met Malachi's long knife with a scream of metal, the force jarring his bones. Malachi moved like a panther, fast, merciless, grinning through blood-slick teeth. His blade flashed for Tobias's ribs. Tobias twisted, the steel kissing his shirt and biting flesh. Pain flared white, but he drove his shoulder hard, slamming Malachi back against the burning rocks. The heat blistered skin, the stink of charred leather choking the air. Malachi's laugh rasped low and cold. "You can't save him, Garrison," he snarled, teeth bared. "This desert eats everything, men, promises, honor. Then it's about to choke." Tobias spat and swung. The bowie carved a red arc across Malachi's forearm. The knife clattered from his grip, but Malachi was still grinning as he lunged barehanded, teeth snapping like a rabid dog. They hit the sand in a tangle of blood and rage, rolling through firelight, fists pounding flesh with wet, ugly sounds. Malachi's fingers found Tobias's throat, iron strong, squeezing until black swam at the edges of his vision. The world narrowed to heat, pain, and those pale eyes burning like frostfire above him. "Any last words?" Malachi hissed, voice a snake's whisper. Tobias's free hand scrabbled in the dirt and closed on cold steel. Malachi's own revolver, half buried in sand. "Yeah," Tobias rasped, lips curling in a blood-cracked grin. "Go to hell!" the Colt roared. Malachi jerked once, eyes wide, blood blooming dark across his chest. His grip slackened. Then he toppled sideways, the sand drinking his life like rain. Tobias lay gasping, smoke clawing his lungs, blood running warm down his side. Every muscle screamed, every breath burned. But Malachi Crow, the devil of the black spurs, was dead. He staggered to his feet, swaying like a drunk, and turned toward the alcove where Dakota lay. The young chief's eyes were half closed, breath a shallow whisper. Tobias stumbled to his knees beside him, lifting his head gently. "You made it," Tobias muttered, voice raw. "You hear me, Dakota? We did it." Dakota's lips curved faintly, a ghost of a smile. His fingers brushed Tobias's hand, weak as a dying flame. "Brother," he whispered, and then the word broke in his throat. "No," Tobias growled, shaking him lightly. "You hang on, damn you, just a little longer." But Dakota's eyes had gone still as moonlit water. Tobias bowed his head over the fallen warrior, the flames casting long shadows across the blood-soaked sand. And then, war cries ripped the night open. From beyond the fire, the earth shook with pounding hooves. Shadows swarmed the horizon, lances flashing, feathers streaming, voices rising like a storm. The great chief had come. The fire burned low, its fury spent, leaving the Jornada painted in blood and ash. Tobias stood in the ruin of men, his shirt scorched and slick with crimson, Dakota's lifeless weight cradled in his arms. Smoke curled around him like the breath of ghosts. Then the ground shook, a deep, rolling thunder that swallowed the silence whole. Tobias turned, squinting through the haze, and saw them crest the horizon. Warriors. Hundreds of them. A tide of horse and steel, feathers streaming like banners, faces streaked with paint that gleamed in the pale firelight. At their head rode a figure draped in eagle feathers, his hair silvered by age and war. The great chief himself, eyes black as obsidian, burning with something Tobias couldn't name. They came like judgment, hooves pounding until the earth itself seemed to tremble. Then, all at once, the sound died. 300 Apache warriors reined in hard, dust boiling around their horses like storm clouds. The great chief swung down without a word. His moccasins whispered across the sand as he walked through the carnage. The broken rifles, the bodies sprawled like discarded dolls, the fire painting everything in hues of hell. He stopped before Tobias. For a long, breathless moment, they stared at each other. Two men bound by blood they hadn't spilled, by a promise kept in a land that ate promises for breakfast. Tobias lowered his gaze, throat tight as rawhide. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "I couldn't." His voice broke like dry wood. The old chief lifted a weathered hand and laid it on Tobias's shoulder. A touch heavy with years, yet steady as a mountain. "You gave him life," the chief said, his voice deep as canyon walls. "And when death came, you stood with him. No man can do more." Then the great chief turned, his voice rising like a war horn in the dawn. And the warriors obeyed. 300 Apaches slid from their saddles and dropped to one knee in the blood-streaked sand. Lances lowered. Heads bowed. The wind caught their feathers and set them whispering like the voices of the dead. Tobias Garrison, rancher, loner, man with nothing left but dust, stood in the smoking heart of the Jornada del Muerto with a dead prince in his arms, and watched an army kneel to him. The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, painting the desert gold. And for the first time in his life, Tobias felt the weight of something heavier than fear. He felt honor. "They say the Jornada swallows men whole," he murmured, eyes on the rising sun. "But I reckon it gave me back my soul." The great chief stepped closer, voice soft as wind over stone. "No," he said. "It gave you a name no bullet can kill." And as the warriors rose, their chant rolling like thunder across the burning sands, Tobias knew the truth. This was no ending. This was the birth of a legend. By sunrise, 300 warriors had knelt in his shadow, and the Jornada del Muerto would never forget the name Tobias Garrison.